Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I'm Ryan White of Rooted in Torah Ministries. This week we are in the Torah portion Bshalach, which is Exodus 13, verse 17 through 17, verse 16. And this is a pretty significant Torah portion, as most of them are, or all of them are, right? This one we are dealing with the events of the flight from Egypt by the Israelites, which is very significant, of course, because this is where Pharaoh finally meets his end. And it's really interesting because realistically, God could have taken them in a route that would have, we see here in the beginning of the Torah portion, which we'll read here in a minute, that he's going to take them in a different route in order to avoid battle with the Philistines. And obviously our God is more than capable enough of taking them in a route where they wouldn't have been trapped by Pharaoh, and yet he does. He intentionally sets a trap where Pharaoh is going to believe that the only outcome possible is victory, the slaughter of all the Israelite leadership and the return to slavery for all of the people who have just come out and had been released by him. And so God is playing on his ego, and he's drawing him into this trap here. And we're really going to kind of focus in on why God does that. Not that we can fathom the mind of God by any means, but we're going to look at what the text tells us, and by looking at ancient culture, we're going to see why this was significant, why this was important, and a very important step for God to do. So let's begin by the blessing of the Torah portion. Baruch et Adonai Hamvarak, Baruch Adonai Hamvarak le'olam va'ed, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim ve'natan lanu et Torato, Baruch atah Adonai noten ha'Torah. Amen and amen. All right, let's jump right in here and let's read the very first verse here, a couple verses of the Torah portion, which is starting in Exodus 13, verse 17. And he says, "Now when Pharaoh had let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, even though it was near. For God had said, the people might change their minds when they went to war and returned to Egypt." So this way of the Philistines, I wanted to take a minute and discuss that, because this is really interesting from history. We actually know, I'm going to be using, this is the Understanding the Old Testament, an introduction to, or an introductory atlas to the Hebrew Bible by Carta Jerusalem. You can get this at holyland-jerusalem.com. I bought this while I was over in Jerusalem at the now I'm blanking on it's one of the museums, the historical archaeological museums there in the land. If you get a chance, I would highly recommend stopping by the museum there. If you send me an email, I can tell you the name. I'm just blanking off the top of my head of the name of that. But it's really important to understand they've got tons of archaeological artifacts and all sorts of amazing things there. So this Torah portion, he's talking about where God's leading them. Remember that when we were in the life of Joseph, Joseph had set his family up in the land of Goshen. And Goshen was a very highly sought after land. I'm going to pull this up here on Logos so you can see it here. And I do apologize, I'm not really able to make a way to show you, just looking this on the screen. I'll kind of describe this. If you look up near the top of Egypt, right, where you see Alexandria and On and Memphis and Zone, and you see these rivers, this is what's known as the Nile Delta. And the Nile Delta, you realize that Egypt did not have rain, or does not have rainfall. They get something like less than an inch a year, I believe, is what, if I remember correctly. But what they do have is they have the annual flooding of the Nile River, right? And so the Nile River, remember the Nile River actually runs from south to north. It's I think one of the only two rivers in the world that do that, if I remember correctly. I'm going off memory here, so don't quote me on that as absolute fact. But if you look in this region here, you'll notice that up here at the top you have this delta where the river head splits into multiple heads. And so this entire land, and you can kind of see this on the map, it's a little bit darker green here. That's because it's part of what's called the Fertile Crescent, which is the area of this region of the world that has a lot of water. Egypt doesn't have water because of rainfall, but they have it because of the Nile River ending here. And so it was a very choice land. It was a very well sought after land because this is where you can raise crops. This is where you can actually live. Everyone else is kind of relying on the annual flooding of the Nile River. So this is the place where we know that Israel had settled in this area. And so let's go back one more time to this map here because this is a little bit easier. But if you see these red lines, this top red line that runs up from On to Zone, and then along the coast to Gaza, and then all the way up to Megiddo. This is an important route. This was basically the primary trade route between Israel and the Egyptian, or between the Egyptians and the people in Canaan. And really, what they were really seeking after, again, we'll go back to this map, because, again, geography is important to recognize. What they were really seeking is that the land of Canaan is essentially this kind of a fertile land bridge. We've got these roads that go across the Arabian desert, but realistically, you're not going to be able to take a large party through there because there's not a lot of water. These are routes that kind of are reserved for the brave and the people who can survive it. And you're not going to be able to bring a large caravan through there with goods to trade. And the idea is to get up to the region, excuse me, of Assyria and Babylonia. And this is a region where there's also a lot of people who live. They live between the two rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris River. And so that's a very fertile land. And there's a lot of stuff that's produced in that region. And so the idea is to go through the land of Canaan to be able to trade with these other nations. And this is, Egypt is always a powerhouse, and the Assyrians and the Babylonians were always kind of a powerhouse in that region. And of course, there's always fights, but ultimately they want to trade with one another, right? And so this little route that we're talking about here from Zone to Gaza is extremely important for the Egyptians. And this is what's actually being referred to here when it says God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines. And if we go, this is the Zondervan Illustrated Bible Backgrounds commentary. And in here, the author, John Walton, he says, scholars considered this road probably to refer to a road in ancient Egypt known as the Way of Horus, and later known as Via Maris, the Way of the Sea. Right? This is a very important road because, again, this is leading them up through there. And so during this time period, and this is where it gets significant, during this time period, we know historically that Egypt kept a very large garrison in this area. And depending on when the Exodus actually occurs, I realize there's a lot of debate among scholarship. Some people put it as early as the 1400s, so the 15th century BC, all the way up to maybe 13th century, the 1200s BC. And what's significant is that if we set a later date for the Exodus, if we set the Exodus to around the 1200s, 1250-ish BC, what's interesting is in this region of the world, let me go back to my map here again, we had what was known as an invasion, historically known as an invasion of the Sea People. So you had these people who came in possibly from Cyprus or Crete or something like that, and they sailed in and they landed here on the Gaza Strip, what we know today as the Gaza Strip. And these people were known as the Philistines. The Philistines is a word that was used for the Sea People, right? And that's our Anglicized version of the word for Philistines, right? But they were the Sea People. And what's significant and what kind of gives me I don't want to say, for certainty on this, but it gives me a strong desire to believe that this is probably more close to the time period around the 1200s, because at this specific point in time, you've got this incursion of the Sea People into the land of Canaan, and Canaan had been basically the Hittites and the Egyptians had been battling over this land for so long, for 400 or 500 years easy. They were battling back and forth, and they were struggling over this land of Canaan, control. And for 100 years, the Egyptians would control it, then the the Assyrians would control them back and forth and back and forth. And then all of a sudden you've got this incursion of foreigners, of sea people. And what happens then? You have the land thrown into chaos, into disarray. And so by the time the Israelites get there 40 years later, what's going on? You don't see the Assyrians, the big nation of Assyria controlling. Now you have Assyrians there, but they're all these different separate kingdoms, right? These small little kingdoms. You realize a kingdom back then was basically a city. King Og, he was basically the king of a city and kind of the surrounding countryside. This wasn't like he's the king over the whole land of Canaan. So it's interesting that in my proposal here is that God used the sea people, the Philistines, to come in and basically create chaos to destroy the control of the Egyptians and the control of the Assyrians, so that basically you have just these small little city-states and everyone kind of on their own rather than a unified front. And so when Israel comes in, God's already prepared the political climate for Israel to come in and wipe them out. And to me, I mean, that's amazing. God used something that we don't even see in the Bible. So if my proposal is correct, and this is the proposal of a lot of scholars, you can read about this in various books out there. But to me, it's amazing that God, if this is true, God used these Philistines to come in and shake up the politics, shake up the military in the region to create a fertile ground for Israel to take when they went into Canaan, rather than fighting against the whole Assyrian army or the whole Egyptian army, right? So we see that. But, again, back to the Torah portion, we do know that, he does talk about the way of the way of the land of the Philistines. So this is probably referring to this road, and again, controlled by the Egyptians at this point in time. So where does that leave us? Well, instead of going, and hopefully you can see this here, so instead of taking this relatively easy route, because realize they lived here, and for them to go, I mean, it would have been easy to just basically kind of cross here and go up to Gaza. But instead, God leads them, and realize there's a lot of debate about this, but he leads them somewhere along where the Red Sea is. He leads them kind of down and around. Why does he do that? Again, our text tells us that he does this to avoid warfare. And then, so let's go back to what specifically it says here. It says, "For God said, the people might change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. Hence God led the people around by way of the wilderness to this Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds." And let's not get too wrapped up in trying to define exactly where this is, because ultimately we know that God did this. And so, regardless of the crossing location, we do see that this actually happened. I know there's a lot of theories out there, and it's good to look into those, but I'm not going to be getting into those personally. So with this in mind, it says God does this so that the people would not change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. We gotta realize what's going on here is a battle for the hearts and minds of Israel. Even after all of the amazing plagues that God poured out on the land of Egypt, even after he slaughters the firstborn of every single firstborn male child in Egypt, and spares Israel, even through all of that, they had trust issues. They had issues where if they saw battle, they might turn around and run. Even though, I mean, if the estimates are correct, they could have had 2 million people. 2 million people, 600,000 men, basically, who were, probably most of them capable of being ready to fight. You got to realize that back then, armies were generally, the whole Egyptian army was around 40,000 strong. You've got 600,000 people, potentially, right? There's of course, there's debates on whether that number is being understood correctly, but let's assume that it's correct. 600,000 people, and they might be afraid, not of the Egyptian army, the 40,000, they might be afraid of the Philistines, who are an even smaller group, a less organized army. What is going on here? Hearts and minds. Hearts and minds. You see, when you've been raised in slavery, when you've been told all of your life that you're worthless, you're nothing, that becomes part of who you are. That becomes part of your psyche. God had a much bigger challenge than just pulling them out and putting them into a land. He had to change their way of thinking about the world and about themselves. He had to get them to understand that they had worth. They have value. You have worth. You have value. Did you know that? That's the message that Scripture is trying to tell you over and over and over again. You matter. Doesn't matter who you are. Doesn't matter what you've done. In God's eyes, you matter. You count. He is looking to rescue each and every one of us. Regardless of whether we're a millionaire or we are so in debt that we can't even afford a home to live in. He is calling each and every one of us. And part of that calling is to look at ourselves. This is why the New Testament focuses so much on the concept of new creation. And Paul talks about you're a new creation, you're a new man, things like this newness, this renewal. This is why Yeshua's ministry is focused on what? Eating with people, touching people, hanging out with people who have been socially marginalized, who've been told, well, you're just a woman, you're just a Gentile, you're just a leper. And he raises them up and he gives us purpose and meaning. And so in doing this, God had to show them one more time, that it was not the Egyptians who were better than them. It was God who was better than all of them. And so he leads them into this camp, right? This camp where they are basically surrounded. They're to camp here, it says here, they're to camp in front of Baal-Zephon, opposite it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say to the sons of Israel, they are wandering aimlessly in the land, and the wilderness has shut them in. And then here we go. This is our statement that we analyzed last week, if you remember. Thus I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will chase after them, and I will be honored through Pharaoh and all of his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. God is going to be honored through Pharaoh. He leads Pharaoh into this trap because he is going to be honored through Pharaoh. What does that mean? Have you ever stopped and asked yourself, why does God need to be honored through Pharaoh? I mean, he's God. He created the universe. He's got all this stuff. Why does he need to be honored? What does it mean to be honored? Why is this so important? This is something that we in the Western world, for those of you who are watching, some of you hopefully who are watching this live in an honor and shame culture, and you understand how significant the Lord being honored actually is, and why this is so important that God intentionally misleads Pharaoh in order to overcome him in the Red Sea, the Sea of Reeds, right? We've got to realize, what was Pharaoh doing to God's children? He was throwing them in the river, and they were drowning. You realize in ancient culture, they believed in what was called the divine river ordeal. And this would be if you have an accusation against someone, what they could do, one of the ways to find out if that accusation was true, especially against women or people who had less rights, you would bind them up, you would throw them in the river, and they believe, because the Egyptians believed there was a god of the Nile River. All the other countries, they believed in gods of these rivers and so on and so forth. And they believed, and we can see this in various texts in this book, the Ancient Near Eastern Text by Pritchard. I keep talking about this. Hopefully you've got this by now. We can see in various places in there where in this divine river ordeal, they would throw the person in the water, and if they survived the raging waters, they believed that the god of that river had deemed the person innocent. But if they drowned, they were judged as guilty. And so Pharaoh is playing off that by throwing the babies in the river and saying, see, the God of the river is not saving their babies. They must be guilty. Why is it, do you think, that when one Hebrew baby survives the waters, Moses, that he's adopted into the royal family? He survived the divine river ordeal. And so he's granted position because he's deemed innocent in their goofy way of understanding things. It's, it seems silly to us, but there's a lot of things that we believe that are silly, or that we talk about that are silly as well, right? How many people have taught their children that there's a fat man in a red suit flying around with reindeer in the sky one night a year, right? We all have these kind of things, and we operate on them, and so on and so forth. What's interesting is God leads them again to a body of water. The Israelites go through, they survive the water. Pharaoh and his army are crushed by it. The true God of creation has made judgment, and he found Israel to be innocent, their hearts to be light as a feather, if you will, in Egyptian language. And he found Pharaoh's heart to be hard, to be weighty, and drowned him, showing that he was unjust. So with that in mind, let's go back to this concept of honor and shame. This is something that, for me, is a very near and dear subject. It's something that I kind of picked up on during my degree program and really fascinated me. And I've done as much studying into the subject as I can. And ultimately, I walked away with writing my thesis for my master's program on it, and it's called Honor and Shame in the Torah. I'm hoping that someday very soon I'm going to have this actually published. This is the version that my school published for me that's only available. I have a copy, and the library has a copy. But in this, and I did it on Honor and Shame in the Torah because unfortunately there's not a whole lot of literature on honor and shame in the Torah. There's a lot of literature on honor and shame in the first century, in the day and times of Yeshua, and there's a little bit that goes back, but there's not a whole lot, and so I did that. And I really hope that you would consider coming onto the website on rootedintorah.com and joining in some of these studies that I have on honor and shame. I'm telling you that once you start studying this subject, it's going to make a whole lot, the Bible, especially the narratives, are going to make a whole lot more sense. It's been amazing for me. And the people I've been able to share this with have really, I've got so much positive response. Wow, that's so amazing. I mean, even in just normal everyday things, I did a teaching on honor and marriage. We took the concepts of honor and shame and applied them to marital relationships. I did this for my relationship, and it did so much to improve and save my marriage. It's one thing I just want to share with everyone because it's really awesome. I'm really excited about this, and unfortunately we're kind of running out of time here, but please check it out on the website as well. There's going to be a course very soon. I'm still working on getting it all put together, but there's going to be a course very soon that goes through honor and shame in my the way that I did it in my thesis. So the basics of honor and shame. Honor and shame is kind of like high school. You had the cool kids and you had the uncool kids, or the nerds or whatever it was. And each school kind of has a different different categories of what makes someone cool and what makes someone uncool. Now take those words and insert instead of cool, honor, and shame, and now you're going to start to kind of understand an honor and shame culture. We got to realize that really up until Western culture came around in the last couple hundred years, every society on earth was based on honor and shame. In fact, 70% of the world today still lives in an honor and shame culture. The big ones: Africa, the Arab nations, Japan, China. These nations all live. A lot of the Latin American cultures still have a lot of honor and shame going on there. And realistically, we ourselves have cultures of honor and shame, but the thing is that we in the Western culture have got so much stuff, and there's so much infrastructure that we don't have to depend on people as much, and so we kind of get away with not standing up to this. So, really quickly, honor and shame. The concept is that there's a limited supply of honor. Not everyone can be the cool kid. Not everyone can be the most honorable person. And so it creates a social hierarchy. You've got the coolest, and you've got kind of, a pecking order, if you will. And everyone, and it's not like this is written down anywhere, but in high school, you kind of knew who the top kid was by he draws a large crowd, everyone looks up to him, everyone talks about him, things like this. And because of this hierarchy, there's a lot of antagonistic behavior. People are vying for position, trying to gain position in this social standing. How do you do this? Do you do this privately? No, you have to do this in the public arena. You have to go in front of everyone because honor and shame is not something tangible. Honor and shame is basically public opinion. The vast majority of people in the school look up to this person and therefore they have honor. So therefore, if you want to have honor, you must go out and do something publicly. Either you do something great, maybe you become the star quarterback and win the football game, or you find someone who's higher up than you and you shame them. You make them look dumb. You make them look like they're not cool. And so they lose position and then you gain position. This is a lot of times, this is why Yeshua, the Pharisees come up to Yeshua and they try to question him. Because if they can catch him, make him slip up, make him not show that he doesn't understand something, they gain social hierarchy. He loses it. Now, shame is not necessarily a bad thing. Being shamed is bad, but shame itself is a good means of social control. For example, adultery. Up until 10, 15 years ago, adultery was a shameful thing in this nation. And the fact that it was shameful controlled people. So, you might see someone passing by, or you might be talking to someone and they make a pass at you. And you start to think, oh, this would feel great if I did this. And then you go, well, wait a minute. If people find out, I'm going to be shunned from my church group. People at work, they're going to shun me. My family will reject me. And so you would feel ashamed of that. And so you don't do that. Right? That is a positive thing. Running around naked, that's a shameful thing. And so we stop doing that once we hit a certain age. These sorts of things are very important for helping control. And we're going to see this as we go through some of the laws in the Torah. And this is what some of the stuff I talk about in here. Some of the laws specifically have punishments based around shaming someone. The whole idea of taking off their shoe and spitting in their face, and forever after this person is known as the person whose shoe was removed in Israel, things like this. These are all honor and shame. So how does this tie into God needing to be honored? Because people will follow whatever God has the most honor. And so it's vital that our God be publicly shown to have the greatest honor, because that's going to attract us to him to follow him, and it's going to attract others to want to follow him. Think about Rahab. And I do apologize, we ran out of time here. I hope that I gave you a little glimpse, and you can come on the website and check out more. We're going to go to the blessing of the Torah portion. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu Torat emet v'chei olam nata beitokenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten ha-Torah. Amen and amen. May Yah bless you and keep you. We'll see you again next week. Shalom, everyone.